Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Khadas Tone 2. Many of you in the past have talked to me about the original Khadas Tone, which I never actually got a chance to try, and so I was keen to give the Tone 2 a try when Khadas offered to send one out. So I want to say a huge thanks first of all to Khadas for making this review possible. They've sent me the unit for review, but as always, that doesn't influence what I'm going to say about it. I'm going to share the good, the bad, and I don't think there's any ugly, but if there is, we'll get to that shortly.
In the dreams we always fight, 'cause we never worked it out. It just kinda slipped through our hands. And I never really said that you hurt me, no instead. I just try to understand. It was so exhausting, so I lost it, had to make it stop. Didn't really feel like giving you the chance to make it up. You asked me what's the problem, to be honest, it was you. That's the truth. It really was such a bad plan.
The Khadas Tone 2 is essentially a fully featured DAC in this tiny little form factor. It's an incredible little bit of engineering, both in terms of the look of it, so the kind of industrial design side of it, but also in what they've managed to pack into a small space. And I think we might start off with a quick tour to give you an idea of exactly what I'm talking about. But before I do that, I want to say that this is a $200 DAC. There are also two other versions. There's a cheaper version, which they call a maker kit. I understand that's just actually the board only without the casing for those that want to build it into other kind of micro PC type setups. There's also a pro version, which to my understanding just adds a set of headphone outputs on here. But this review is going to be focused entirely on the regular Tone 2. I should also mention before we get into the tour, this little extra bit you can see sticking off here, that's a Bluetooth module, it's an extra add-on, and that's a $45 add-on. I'll talk about how that works shortly. Before I do though, let's give a tour of the device. And I might start on the back. Looking at the back of the device, things are pretty simple, but there's actually a lot going on. We've got two USB-C sockets. The first one is for your signal input for USB. It'll also provide the power in most situations. The next USB-C socket is an I2S and or power and or for the Bluetooth module there. And this is what I mean, there's a lot going on even though it looks simple. So just to recap, if you've got say a USB-C signal coming into the first socket, you can also run a linear power supply, apparently using a special cable you need to get from Khadas. I haven't tried that, I don't have the specific cable, but you can apparently run a linear power supply into the I2S socket. I did some testing running power just through a regular USB-C cable and that seemed to work fine, so I don't know if there's a difference there when you're getting the specific cable from Khadas or if it still works the same. And then the final functionality, which you'll have already seen, is you can plug in the Bluetooth module. While we're talking about the Bluetooth module, you've already seen that it's really tiny and I said it's $45. This is going to give you the ability to send high-res Bluetooth into the Tone 2 using an LDAC protocol or the lower level protocols if you want to, of course. And you literally just buy this, plug it in, pair your device, and then select the input on the Tone 2. Very, very simple and sounds really good too. It's still Bluetooth, it's still not absolutely lossless, but it sounds excellent. Moving on with our tour. Along the back here, we've then got three RCA sockets, but they're not irregular RCA sockets. These are balanced RCAs. And this is a new invention as I understand it from Khadas themselves. And what it means you can actually do is plug in a regular single-ended RCA cable or buy a specific cable from Khadas that has the contact set up in such a way that you're getting a 3-pin or 3-connection output from each of these sockets. And so it's going to give you the ability to take balanced RCA out of here and run it into an XLR balanced amp. And so I'm also assuming that means you could get the equivalent of an AES to an RCA cable for the SPDIF input. I haven't checked that one, so do check out the website if that's something that interests you. But the cool thing here is there's lots of innovation going on. We've got this multifunction USB-C socket, the I2S one. We've got balanced RCAs that are also perfectly functional as single-ended. And it's all coming in this tiny, tiny package. And the interesting design doesn't stop there. If we look at the top of the device, you've got this control wheel here. Underneath the control wheel, there's a little light ring. I'll talk about the light ring in a moment. But the control ring, as well as giving you this lovely kind of slightly tactile feel to turn up the volume, it also lets you skip tracks, choose filters, choose inputs. And the way it does that is it's also a press button. And this is where we do start to get something that I'd probably say is maybe bad in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly I mentioned before. I don't think it goes quite as far as ugly, but I'm not a fan of it. And that is that the press button is not down on the device. It's actually pulling from the back of the device towards the front. So you're going to push the ring kind of from the back towards the front of the device, and you're going to get a really slight click. It's very, very subtle with the feedback. It's enough that you can feel it, but it's also enough that you can sometimes miss it. And why this is a problem for me is that if you want to move between the modes, so going from volume mode to filter mode to source mode, and then also if you want to lock it, it's always using a combination of presses. So double presses to move between modes, triple press to lock it. Where the problem starts with that though is that this is so compact and light that when it's sitting on your desk and you go to press it, the whole thing wants to move, and it does make it very difficult to sometimes feel if you've made enough presses. And so often when I've gone to do a double press to say get into the filter function, instead I haven't been able to feel if I've done 2 presses yet, so I press it again thinking I've only done 1, and all of a sudden I've locked the device. I've then got to do 3 presses to unlock it and start again. It's not a big deal, but it's a little bit finicky and slightly annoying, and I would have loved to see them actually just do a vertical press down. It would have been much cleaner. If you're doing a vertical press down, it's not sliding around on your desk, and it's going to give you a much cleaner sense of how well you've pressed it. So that's a minor gripe that I've had. It's not a deal breaker, but it is a little bit finicky. What I find is I've kind of got to have the unit on the desk and hold it as I click it, and it's just a bit fiddly and a bit annoying. The other thing that I find a bit annoying is the fact that the ring light sits underneath the control wheel. And so what that means is that when you're looking down from the top, you can't see the status of the device. You can't tell what volume it's at. You can't see the filters when you're trying to choose filters, or the input selection if you're changing that. And so what I find I have to keep doing is picking up the device and kind of peering in under the control wheel every time I want to change something. On top of that, the way the ring light works is that when you're choosing either filters or inputs, what will happen is the whole ring light will turn red, and then a small segment of the light is going to turn blue if you're in the filter mode, it's going to turn yellow if you're in the selection mode, that's input selection, and you're going to have to look at the ring light and see where in the ring light that particular segment is to tell you what it is that you're set to. And I've got 2 issues with that. Firstly, it means you really need the manual on hand to see which segment position means what. It's not labelled anywhere, it's not exactly self-explanatory. But then on top of that, when you start to get to the positions of the segment when it goes up to the top kind of back of the ring light, you've really got to pick the device up and peer right down behind it to see what's going on. And I'm not a huge fan of that. I think they could have chosen a different design here where you could see the ring light more effectively from anywhere on the device and still get the same benefits. To make it clear, I love the form factor, I love the design, I think it's really spectacular and innovative, but from a usability point of view, it's just clumsy. Again, it's not enough to be a deal breaker and for me to say don't buy this. We'll get to the sound in a moment because that's really what's going to matter. But for me, it is a bit of a drawback that it's just a bit finicky to use the interface. Probably the saving grace here is there are things that you're not going to be setting very often, and so the fact that only once every now and again you're going to have to kind of pick it up, peer under there, work out the setting you want, and then be able to put the DAC back down and just enjoy it, that's the only thing saving it. If you needed to do that more regularly, it's going to be a deal breaker, I think. I probably should mention at this point that you can set the input selection to an auto mode, and that's great. It's going to default then to the USB input as your primary. And so it is kind of helpful that you can do that because that means there's one less reason to have to look for that ring light. But if you're someone that wants to jump between USB, coaxial, Bluetooth or I2S, then it might be a bit of an issue for you the way that selection system works. Filter selection's not so much. I find, at least for me, I tend to play with the filters when it's new, work out which one I like and leave it there. But the input selection, that's going to depend on how you use it. And so with all that said, let me wrap up by saying, from a form point of view, I think this is spectacular. From a function point of view, I think it's got all the functions you might want, but the actual interaction with those functions is a little bit iffy. So let's jump in now to talking about sound and see if that can redeem the Tone 2. Trying to work out what gear you should buy next? Have a look at the Passion for Sound Recommends link down in the description below. Clicking on the link will take you through to my Patreon page, and specifically a post where you can click on the Airtable image to go through to my recommended product database. Once you're in the database, you can use the filter button up the top to choose which sorts of product types you want to have a look at, maybe headphones, maybe DACs, maybe amps. Choose the one or ones that you want to see from this list, and then you can also sort the list by price if you want to, or other features as well. You'll then see a consolidated list just of the product types you want to have a look at, including things like what the retail price was when I last checked. You've got links to my reviews of each product, and then also links to where you can go and buy them. Feel free to play around with the filters and sorting options as much as you like to find the gear you're looking for, and I hope that this database points you in just the right direction for you. So happy hunting, happy listening, and now let's get back to the review. Keeping in mind that I've only tested this with single-ended outputs from the RCA sockets, and what I would say is that the sound from the Tone 2 is really solid for the price. The tonality is what I would call neutral/natural. It's not lean, it's not thick, it's just a nice balanced midpoint. The soundstage is somewhat limited in terms of size and scale, but I've got no complaints at all. Remembering this is a $200 device. It's not meant to compare with $600, $500 DACs. It's a compact, kind of pseudo-transportable, portable-ish type solution, and from that point of view, I think it's performing really well. I also find that within that somewhat limited soundstage, the separation is good, it's solid. But as is often the case, the best way to put these things into context is with some direct comparisons. So I had a look around my office to see what else I had here that sat somewhere around the price and was comparable in terms of features and functionality. But I just realised that I've jumped the gun. I should mention I tried the inputs for the DAC using both coaxial and USB, and in both cases what I was hearing was very comparable sound. So the good news is that I think the Tone 2 is managing each input very, very well. And the other thing that stood out to me was that when I did play with some external power, meaning that I was taking the USB audio signal through the USB socket and sending the power through the other socket, the other USB-C socket, separating the power and the signal had very little impact for me. I wasn't using a full high-quality linear power supply. I was just using some different kind of battery type supplies and a phone charger type supply. But in both cases, that should be cleaner than a USB socket. And yet what I found was the Tone 2 didn't really change in sound, and that's a good thing. That means the Tone 2 is doing a really good job of keeping the sound and the power noise separate in terms of USB. Of course, if you've got a really noisy USB socket on your computer, you may find benefit in splitting them out, but for me, with my setup, it really wasn't an issue. And so now having covered that, let's get on to the comparisons to start off with the SMSL SU6. The SU6 behind me here is a really compact, fully featured desktop DAC. It takes mains power input, but other than that, it's very similar to the Tone 2. And what I mean by that is you get basic inputs, you're getting coaxial, you do get optical here, you've got a USB-C input, and on this occasion you've got the Bluetooth built in. There's no balanced outputs from this one, and it's in a much bigger package as you can see here. Comparing the SU6 to the Tone 2, and I'm going to stack them to show you just how big the difference is. Comparing the two with each other, I was using the Meza Elites and the Burson Audio Soloist GT amp, and one of the tracks I tried was On the Couch by Prince. My first impression starting off with the Tone 2 was just how great it sounded. This is a nicely recorded track, and the Tone 2 absolutely did it justice. The vocals are nicely separated from the mix, and all the instrumentation is clean and punchy and well defined. Jumping over to the SU6, and what I heard was a pretty similar performance. I think the SU6 was maybe just a tiny bit smoother, and that could be a good or bad thing depending on your tastes. But for me, as I went back and forth between the two, they're essentially identical performing DACs. As I said, you could maybe split them on smoothness, but I wouldn't want to try to pick it blind. And that to me really shows, as I said before, just how well the Tone 2 is managing power. The fact that this is running on USB power, and that's just a generic motherboard socket on my desktop PC, the fact that it's running on that power and managing to stay clean and smooth and high quality when compared to a mains powered device, that says that the Tone 2 is doing a fantastic job. And so at this point, we've got a $170 DAC in the SU6. So that's $170, including having Bluetooth on board. You're paying a little bit less than for the Tone 2 without Bluetooth. But then you've got the Tone 2 for $200 that's got this really striking design and balanced output capabilities. And so for me, it's kind of a wash between these two. It's going to come down to what you prefer, and I will talk shortly when I get to the summary about one of the things that I think you need to take into account with the Tone 2 to do with its form factor. But for now, let's just say that I think both of these are performing at a very similar level and should be considered within the same decision-making process. But the fact that I was thinking about the power management from the Tone 2 from USB-C got me to thinking about other products that work in a similar way. And so my next comparison was with a dongle, and in this case it's the Moondrop Moonriver 2. I chose the Moonriver 2 because it's just $10 cheaper than the Tone 2, and there's some similarities here because the Tone 2 is going to give you a balanced output. You've got a 4.4mm balanced headphone socket there, and so if you take one of these, plug in USB-C and max out the output levels, you've essentially got a balanced line level DAC. And so I fired up both once again. This time I was using the balanced output from the Moonriver 2 going into the Burson Soloist GT, and I was still having to use the single-ended from the Tone 2 because I didn't have the Khadas balanced cables. What I heard as I listened to these was that the Moonriver 2 and the Tone 2 aren't vastly different. That said, what I was hearing from the Moonriver 2 was a slightly punchier, maybe slightly fuller sound in the bass, but it was coming because I think the bass is a little bit looser, a little bit less controlled from the Moonriver 2. It felt to me like the Tone 2 just had a better grip over the music. It was better controlling and defining everything in the mix. I also found that the Moonriver 2 wasn't giving the same degree of separation in the sound. So instruments were better separated, better defined in space from the Tone 2. And the Moonriver 2 wasn't bad, but it just couldn't quite keep up. Ultimately, I'd say that the sound from the Tone 2 was just overall more refined. So it's giving you very similar kind of tonality and qualities in many ways, but just refining everything a bit, tightening it up, separating things better, defining sounds in space, just all slight incremental improvements. And I'm going to put that down to the fact that in the Tone 2, there's more real estate for circuitry. In the case of any sort of dongle, they're having to miniaturize the circuit, and that requires trade-offs. Whereas with the Tone 2, you've got a little bit more space to work with. It's still incredibly compact, but the result is that it's giving you just that slightly more refined, controlled, and just overall better sound quality. And so realistically, I think you could choose any of the three that are on my desk here. If you don't care about form factor exactly, then probably the SU6 is the best choice. If you want maximum portability and the option to drive headphones, then obviously the Moonriver 2 is a good option. And then that kind of brings us back to the one question I've got about the Tone 2. And that is, what's it meant to be? Because it's not a true portable device in the way that a dongle is, because you don't have a headphone output. If you were going to use this for its size and you wanted a very portable form factor, then you're either going to have to buy the Tone 2 Pro, which as I said includes the headphone outputs, or you're going to have to match it up with something like this all the time. So this is just the Topping X7. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best choice for it, but the point is you're going to have to pair it with some kind of external headphone amplifier. And by the time you do that, you might be better off with the Topping G5. Now to make things really clear here, the Tone 2 is offering you things that nothing else at its price seems to do, which is these balanced outputs, potentially an AES input. And so I'm not for a second suggesting you shouldn't consider this, but I do want to flag the fact that the form factor is good, but it's also hampering it a little bit. As I said before, it makes it less convenient in a desktop setup. Because of that issue of kind of dragging it across the desk when you're trying to press the selector button, it just means it's a little bit less ergonomically friendly than something like the SU6. And it's not particularly that much better from a transportability point of view because you've then got to add an amplifier. And so I'm just left questioning a little bit where this sits in the world. It's a great product. I love the form factor. I love the design from a conceptual point of view. I love the innovation of the balanced outputs. I think all that is fantastic. But the only place I really see this working for someone is if you've got a really compact space you're working in. And then I just wonder if you're better off going straight to the Tone 2 Pro and having the headphone sockets on the actual device. That makes buckets of sense to me. I'm imagining a device like this for someone that works in an office and goes in and out, maybe commuting. You could take one of these with you, pop it on the desk, and have really great quality sound for $200 odd bucks. Or if it's the Tone 2 Pro, obviously a little bit more. But then that says to me, what's the point in the Tone 2? If you are going into an office where you've got limited space, then you're going to have to buy one of these and then also buy an amplifier, which is going to be about the same size as the SU6 if you buy something like the SH6. Or you're getting a portable amp like the NX7, and suddenly there's kind of no need to have this being quite as small as it is. So that's my quandary on this one. I love it as a device. The performance is excellent for the price. The innovation is fantastic. But I'm going to have to leave you with a question rather than a solution. And that is to say that I think if you're looking at this, if you're interested in this, remember that whilst it performs incredibly well and it's got some very powerful functions and features in terms of the balanced connectivity and the USB-C socket for the Bluetooth, you really do need to consider, I think, whether or not it's going to work for you ergonomically. Whether it's worth spending $200 on this when you can spend $170 on this. I think the Tone 2 is probably just as good, maybe even a hair better by the time you go balanced, but you need to work out if the ergonomics of this are going to work for you. If it is going to work for you, then I can recommend this device from a sonic point of view with those caveats I've already said. And so on that note, I'm going to kind of have to wrap up without a resolution here. As I said, I'm leaving you with a question, not so much a recommendation. I hope though it's still provided some clarity for you as to where this sits in the world, how it might work for you or might not work for you. I'd love to hear in the comments down below what people think about this. Can you see use cases that I haven't mentioned here? Does it work for you? Have you already got one perhaps and you love it? Have you got one and you don't love it? Put all those sorts of comments down below. I'd love to hear what you've got to say about it. And as I said, I hope the review's been useful and helpful at introducing you to the Khadas Tone 2. Rhyming not intended. If the review has been useful and helpful, or you've just enjoyed it, I'd love it as always if you hit the like button and consider subscribing and ring the notification bell if you haven't already. But for now, let me leave it to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.